Who is Steven Wilson, and why has he remixed Chicago 2? Hi, this is TJR, and I'm going to be talking today about the new reissuing and also remixing of Chicago 2. Now, Chicago 2 is named Chicago 2 in the same way that the album The Beatles is referred to as the White Album. The album was originally released as The Beatles, but it's been called the White Album, and that name is stuck. This album is actually just entitled Chicago, but fans refer to it as Chicago 2, and that name is also just kind of stuck. Chicago's first album was under the band name Chicago Transit Authority. And then after that first album, their name was shortened to Chicago. So they just called the second album Chicago, but fans call it Chicago 2. At any rate, though, when I first heard about this remixing of this album, my first question is, well, who is Steven Wilson? Because it said so, when I looked up this album release on Amazon, it said Chicago 2, the Steven Wilson remix. And I'm like, who's Steven Wilson? I did some, I looked at the listing for the album on Amazon. It didn't give me any information about who he was. Even when I checked the liner notes for this re-release here, there was nothing about who Steven Wilson was. There was no information about his previous credits. So I decided to do something I've never done before. I took some initiative and I looked Steven Wilson up on the internet, and I found out who he was. And much to my chagrin, I must say I'm a bit embarrassed that as a musician, I had not heard of Steven Wilson previously. Steven Wilson is a critically acclaimed progressive rock musician, and he's also a Grammy-nominated musician. He is best known for his musical work with the progressive band Porcupine Tree, and also his own solo work. But along with remixing this classic Chicago album, he has also done a lot of, from what I've heard, very impressive stereo remixes of albums like XTC's Skylarking and the Fragile album by Yes. He's done a lot of these, surround sound stereo 5.1 remixes for a lot of great progressive bands like Jethro Tull and Roxy Music. And so I'm actually very excited now because some of these albums that he's remixed are albums that I'm a huge fan of, and I'd like to hear what his remixes sound like. But getting on to this album, Chicago 2 is best known by casual fans for the hit singles 25 or 6 to 4, Make Me Smile, and Color My World. But the album is so much more than that. It's an amazing audio experience, this album. And now, the first thing I noticed as I listened to this remixing, and by the way, I should state here, for this review, I pulled out the Rhino Records remaster of this album, which is the most recent version you can get, and I compared it to this new remixing of the album. And Rhino Records, by the way, is responsible for both of these releases. So I compared tracks back to back in doing this. And I should mention here the difference between a remastering and a remixing is as follows. In a remastering, you're going to the original stereo, the final stereo mix. You're not touching that mix in any way, shape, or form. You're not touching the individual tracks. You're just enhancing and sweetening the audio of the final stereo mix is all you're doing. With a remixing, you're going back to all the original tracks and you are completely remixing the album from scratch. Now, in his notes, Steven Wilson clearly states that he wanted to be as faithful as possible to the original mix, but he feels that the original mix doesn't quite bring out all the subtle nuances that he feels the album should have. So that was his goal in doing this remixing. Now, the first thing I noticed is that this version is not louder. In fact, it's actually a little bit quieter than this version. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. This means that in doing this new remix, and of course then it has to be mastered, he resisted the temptation to compress it or to over-compress it, which sometimes when I listen to a remaster, all they've really done is make the album just a few dBs louder. It's all they've really done. And it seems impressive at first, but there's really nothing different about the way it sounds. They just made it louder. So this is not louder. It's actually a little bit quieter. And that also might work in its favor because The point of this is for you to hear the nuances of each individual track, each individual instrument. And can you hear that? Yes, you can. But is this better than this? No. It's also not worse either. It's just simply different. And I think the comparison I'll make is the stereo 2009 remasters of the Beatles catalog versus the mono 2009 remasters of the same catalog. When I listened to the first Beatles album, Please Please Me, and I listened to the title track, Please Please Me, which is one of my favorite Beatles songs of their early period, when I hear the stereo version, I do hear a lot more definition. But when I hear the mono version, it's a much thicker, beefier sound. The guitars have a much thicker sound in the mono version over the stereo version. Personally, I prefer the mono version of that particular track over its stereo counterpart. That's just a personal preference. And while I'm listening to these, yeah, it's interesting to hear the subtleties and nuances. But I also really like how this version just has a beefier sound. It just has a thicker sound. And I think that's what it comes down to with these two versions here. In his liner notes, once again, Steven Wilson states he's not trying to replace this. He's just giving you a different way to hear it. And I agree with that. I think this is a new way to hear this album. And if you're a big fan of Chicago, I don't think there's any way that you can really pass this up. So I'm going to take a moment now and talk about the packaging of this album. This remixing of the album goes through great pains to give you kind of that miniature vinyl experience. This does pretty much replicates what this album looked like on vinyl when it was originally released. The only difference being, of course, the inclusion of the Rhino Records label right there on the end there, and a few other little things that are a bit different. But otherwise, this is what the original interior looked like. When you pull out the CD, you see what looks like at first the original Columbia Records record label, but this is actually Rhino. But other than that, they've done their best to try to just replicate what this looked like when it was on Capitol Records initially. Now there is an insert here, and the insert also, once again, we're trying to replicate the original vinyl experience here in miniature. So it replicates the original poster that came with the original vinyl record here, with these pictures of the band member. On the other side, of course, of the original vinyl version, I'm assuming it was just blank white, because you'd put that, maybe hopefully you were going to put that poster on your wall. But instead, we have, of course, these notes here from Steven Wilson, and of course, track information here as well, and that sort of thing, and then the usual credit information about the personnel involved in the recording of the album. And so, nice job there, just giving us this kind of mini vinyl recreation experience, at least as close as possible to the original vinyl packaging. I'm really glad that I discovered this version, and I also want to thank my my YouTube pal Louis on drums, who did a video about this first, and I want to thank him for doing his video on it first to kind of make me aware of this. And I'd like to make you aware of this release also as well, especially if you're a big fan of Chicago. Chicago was one of those bands that I grew up with and mainly knew them for their hits. It wasn't until the last 5, 7, 8 years or so that I really began to explore their actual catalog and began to realize what an incredibly progressive band they were. And of course, like I said, this is readily available, this new remixing of the album. And of course, this is available too, the Rhino Records remastering, which does feature some bonus tracks as well. And at any rate, this is TJR. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found this video useful. Have you heard this remixing? What do you think? How do you compare it to the original stereo mix? Love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching.